cop shaved a little black girl's hair against her will, but when her father showed up, everything changed. It all started on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon outside Brookwood Middle School in Indianapolis, Indiana. The final bell had rung, and students flooded out of the doors, eager to head home. Among them was 12-year-old Ania Benson, standing near the curb, scrolling through her phone while waiting for her father to pick her up. Ania was a bright student, straight A's, active in the debate club, and known for her kindness. But the first thing people often noticed about her wasn't her intelligence. It was her hair. Thick, coiled, and always styled with care. Her curls were a symbol of pride, something her father had instilled in her since she was a little girl. She stood there, minding her business, when a black and white police cruiser slowed to a stop a few feet away. The door opened, and Officer Reynolds stepped out. Stocky build, crew-cut hair, the kind of guy who carried himself like he had something to prove. He surveyed the area, eyes locking onto Ania. "Aren't you a little far from home?" His voice was casual, but something about the way he looked at her sent a chill through her spine. Ania glanced up, confused. "I'm waiting for my dad," she replied, tucking her phone into her hoodie pocket. Reynolds took a step closer. "What's your name?" She hesitated. She didn't owe him an answer, but something about his tone made her uneasy. "Ania," she said finally. Reynolds studied her for a moment, then reached for his radio. "We got a possible match on that runaway report. African-American female, around 12 or 13, wearing a grey hoodie and jeans." Ania's heart started pounding. "I'm not a runaway," she said firmly. "I'm just waiting for my dad." But Reynolds wasn't listening. He muttered something into his radio, then turned back to her. "Come with me, kid. We'll sort this out at the station." Ania's stomach clenched. "No, I didn't do anything wrong." The school parking lot was still full of kids, parents, and teachers, yet somehow no one seemed to be paying attention to what was happening. Her pulse raced. That's when Reynolds reached for his handcuffs. Ania took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "You can't do this!" she cried. But he didn't care. Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around her small wrists, biting into her skin. A few students gasped. A teacher finally noticed, hurrying toward them. "Officer, what's going on here?" "Runaway situation," Reynolds said dismissively. The teacher frowned. "I know this girl. She's not a runaway." Reynolds barely looked at her. "That's for us to determine." Ania's throat tightened as he pushed her toward the squad car. No one stopped him. No one intervened. And just like that, she was being taken away. Without cause, without reason, without anyone standing up for her. But she wasn't just any kid. And Officer Reynolds had no idea who he had just messed with. The police cruiser pulled away from the school. Ania pressed against the cold leather seat, hands still cuffed behind her back. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing. How was this happening? How could this happen? She turned toward the window, watching the school disappear as panic clawed at her chest. She had seen stories like this on the news, wrongful arrests, racial profiling, but she never imagined she'd be in one. Officer Reynolds glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You got a guardian or someone we should call?" "My dad," she said through clenched teeth. "He's on his way to pick me up. This is a mistake." Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head. "Every kid says that." Ania swallowed the lump in her throat. "I have a school ID in my bag. It proves who I am. You can call my school. They'll tell you I'm not a runaway." But Reynolds didn't even look back. "We'll sort it out at the precinct." Ania clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "This isn't fair," she muttered. Reynolds scoffed. "Life isn't fair, kid." The ride felt endless, every second stretching longer than the last. By the time they pulled into the Marion County Police Department, her stomach was in knots. The car rolled through the back entrance, stopping near a grey steel door. Reynolds got out first, then opened the back door, grabbing her arm like she was a criminal. Out! Ania stumbled as he led her inside, past officers typing at desks and answering calls. A few glanced in their direction, some with curiosity, others with indifference. No one questioned why a young girl was being dragged in cuffs through the station. A female officer, Sergeant Whitaker, noticed and frowned. "What's this?" "Picked her up outside Brookwood Middle. Matches a runaway report," Reynolds said flatly. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "You sure?" Reynolds shrugged. "Close enough." Ania's chest tightened. "Close enough." Sergeant Whitaker studied her, arms crossed. "She doesn't look like a runaway to me." Ania jumped at the chance. "Because I'm not. My name is Ania Benson. My dad is coming to pick me up. You can check my school records." Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. "Did you search her?" Reynolds exhaled, clearly annoyed. "She's a kid. What's she gonna have? A concealed weapon?" "Policy," Whitaker said firmly. "And take the cuffs off. She's not resisting." Reynolds rolled his eyes but unlocked the cuffs. Ania rubbed her sore wrists, blinking away tears of frustration. "Take her to holding," Reynolds muttered before walking off. Ania's stomach dropped. Holding. Sergeant Whitaker seemed hesitant but nodded toward a side door. "Come on, sweetheart." Ania followed, her legs heavy. They walked through a narrow hallway until they reached a small processing room with grey walls and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. "Sit," Whitaker instructed, gesturing to a hard plastic chair. Ania sat, her arms crossed over her chest. "I don't belong here." Whitaker sighed. "I know." She typed something into the computer. "Let's see if we can clear this up." But before she could do anything, Reynolds reappeared, holding a pair of scissors in one hand. "We need to cut her hair," he said, as if he were discussing paperwork. Ania's heart stopped. Whitaker frowned. "Excuse me?" "Standard procedure," Reynolds said casually. "Sanitation reasons." Whitaker shook her head. "That's not a thing." Reynolds smirked. "It is now." Ania's hands gripped the sides of the chair. "You can't do this!" Reynolds' smirk didn't fade. "Watch me." And that's when things went from bad to something much, much worse. Ania's body went stiff. Her fingers dug into the plastic seat beneath her as she stared at the scissors in Officer Reynolds' hand. You can't," she stammered. "You can't just cut my hair." Reynolds shrugged. "It's policy." Sergeant Whitaker's expression darkened. "No, it's not." Reynolds let out a dry chuckle, twirling the scissors between his fingers. "Well, let's call it new policy then. Kids come in, we make sure they're clean. That hair of hers, who knows what could be in it?" Ania's breath hitched. "There's nothing in my hair. You're just trying to humiliate me." Reynolds tilted his head. "Or maybe I'm just following procedure. Now sit still, or I'll have to do this the hard way." Ania's hands shot up to protect her curls, but before she could move, Reynolds grabbed the back of her hoodie and yanked her forward. "Stop!" Whitaker's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. "This isn't happening." Reynolds turned to her, eyes narrowing. "Are you interfering with an officer's duties, Sergeant?" "I'm interfering with whatever power trip you're on." The two locked eyes in a silent battle, but Reynolds was determined. He turned back to Ania and grabbed a handful of her hair. Ania screamed, thrashing in the chair, kicking out desperately. But Reynolds was stronger. His grip tightened, jerking her head back. Whitaker lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "That's enough!" "Let go," Reynolds growled. "She's a child. She's a suspect." Whitaker stepped between them, breathing hard. You want to violate a kid, you do it without me." Reynolds glared at her, chest rising and falling with anger. Then, without another word, he shoved the scissors onto the table and stormed out of the room. The second he was gone, Anaya let out a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. Her scalp burned where he had pulled her hair. Sergeant Whitaker crouched beside her. "Are you okay?" Tears welled in Ania's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I just want my dad." Whitaker nodded and reached for the phone. "We're calling him now." But before she could dial, another officer stepped into the room, Captain Monroe, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a no-nonsense expression. His sharp eyes flicked from Anaya to Whitaker. "Where's Reynolds?" Monroe asked, his voice low. "Gone," Whitaker said. "Tried to pull some—" She exhaled, shaking her head. "It's handled." Monroe turned to Anaya. "You okay, kid?" Anaya could barely speak. She just nodded. Monroe's gaze softened slightly. "Your father's on his way." Anaya exhaled in relief, but that relief was short-lived because suddenly Reynolds was back in the doorway, smug as ever. "Judge Benson just arrived," he announced, like it was no big deal. "Let's see if he can talk his way out of this one." Whitaker's head snapped up. "Wait, Judge Benson?" Reynolds grinned. "That's right." And for the first time since she had been taken, Anaya saw fear flicker in Reynolds' eyes. Because he had just arrested the daughter of one of the most powerful judges in the state, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted instantly. The usual murmur of ringing phones and shuffling paperwork vanished as an imposing figure stepped through the front entrance. Judge Elijah Benson. 6'3", broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal grey suit that made it clear he was not a man to be taken lightly. His sharp brown eyes scanned the room with controlled fury, his lips pressed into a tight line. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Officer Reynolds straightened up, but his smirk wavered. "Judge Benson, good evening." Elijah didn't answer. His gaze flicked over the precinct until it landed on her. Anaya stood there, small, fragile-looking, her hoodie wrinkled, her wrists red from the cuffs. And despite trying to hold it together, her eyes shone with unshed tears. His hands clenched into fists. "Dad." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it hit him like a gunshot. In 3 strides, he was at her side. His large hands cupped her face gently, his eyes scanning her as if making sure she was still in one piece. "Anaya." His voice was soft but firm. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but her eyes flicked toward Reynolds. Elijah followed her gaze. And then he turned. His entire presence shifted. Slow, calculated, dangerous. His eyes locked onto Reynolds, who suddenly wasn't smirking anymore. "You arrested my daughter," Elijah said, voice even. Reynolds forced a shrug. "She matched a—" Elijah took a step closer. "You arrested my daughter." Reynolds swallowed. "She fit the description of a runaway." Elijah cut him off. "Did you confirm her identity before putting your hands on her?" Reynolds hesitated. Silence. And then Elijah tilted his head, voice deadly quiet. "You didn't." The entire room held its breath. Reynolds tried to recover. "She resisted detainment." Elijah turned to Captain Monroe. "Did my daughter resist arrest?" Monroe didn't even hesitate. "No, sir. She was cooperative." Elijah's nostrils flared. "So she was handcuffed, detained and nearly assaulted. Because of what, Officer Reynolds? A hunch?" Reynolds stammered, but there was nothing he could say. And then Elijah dropped the final blow. "I want all the security footage," he said coldly. "Every second of it. Now." Captain Monroe nodded, and gestured to Whitaker. "Get it pulled." Reynolds went pale. Elijah crossed his arms. "You work for me now, Reynolds." His voice was ice. "And you just put your entire career in my hands." For the first time that night, Ania felt safe. But this wasn't over, not even close. It only took 20 minutes for the footage to be pulled. 20 minutes for the entire precinct to witness exactly what happened in that back room. The screen flickered to life, showing Reynolds gripping Ania's hair, yanking her head back, the flash of the silver scissors in his hand. The room went silent. Elijah Benson stood at the front of the monitor, arms folded, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the screen as the video played. No one spoke. No one moved. Every single officer in the room knew what this meant. When the footage ended, Captain Monroe exhaled sharply, turning toward Elijah. "Sir, Elijah held up a hand. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "I want to hear from him." He turned to Reynolds, who was now visibly sweating. "You want to explain?" Elijah's voice was sharp, controlled. "Or should we just go straight to internal affairs?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping someone, anyone, would step in to defend him. But no one did, not even Whitaker. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I was just following standard procedures." Elijah took a step closer. "What procedure justifies putting your hands on my daughter like that?" Reynolds swallowed. "What procedure justifies attempting to cut off a child's hair?" Elijah's voice never rose, but the weight of it pressed down on everyone in the room. Reynolds opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Elijah nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Then he turned to Captain Monroe. "I want his badge. Now." Monroe didn't hesitate. He reached for his radio. "Get IA down here. Effective immediately, Officer Reynolds is relieved of duty pending investigation." Reynolds' face drained of color. "Wait. Badge and gun. Now." Monroe's voice was firm. Reynolds' hands trembled as he unlatched the badge from his uniform, setting it down on the table with an audible clink. Then slowly, he removed his holster and placed the gun beside it. Elijah tilted his head. "You think this ends here?" Reynolds looked up, panic flashing in his eyes. "Judge Benson, this precinct will be hearing from my lawyers," Elijah cut him off. "And so will the media." At that, Reynolds visibly flinched. Elijah turned to Ania, his eyes softening for the first time since he walked in. "Come on, sweetheart. We're going home." Ania didn't need to be told twice. She practically ran to her father's side, gripping his hand as he led her toward the exit. As they walked out, every single officer in that room was left staring at Reynolds, and for the first time he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. But just because he lost his badge didn't mean the fight for justice was over. Not yet. The story broke that same night. By the time Elijah and Ania made it home, news anchors were already dissecting the footage. The headlines were everywhere. Indianapolis officer under investigation for assault on 12-year-old black girl. Police precinct faces scrutiny after attempted forced haircut. Judge's daughter wrongfully detained. Internal Affairs launches inquiry. The video spread like wildfire. People shared it, reposted it, demanded answers. By morning, a crowd had gathered outside the Marion County Police Department. Protesters, community leaders, even local politicians. They weren't just angry, they were furious. Ania sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, watching it all unfold. It felt surreal, seeing her own face on the screen, hearing people chant her name in the streets. Her father sat beside her, his phone buzzing constantly. Calls from lawyers, reporters, even the mayor's office. But his attention was on her. "You okay, sweetheart?" His voice was softer now, not the sharp blade it had been in the precinct. Ania shrugged. She didn't know how to answer that. "I just don't get it." Elijah frowned. "What don't you get?" She swallowed. Why? Why did he do it? Elijah exhaled slowly. Because some people think they can do whatever they want to us, that they won't face consequences. Anaya chewed her lip. But he is, right? Elijah's jaw tensed. He's under investigation. That's a start. But investigations weren't justice. Not yet. And sure enough, just 3 days later, the precinct released a statement. While Officer Reynolds' actions were inappropriate, we have found no criminal wrongdoing. He will be placed on unpaid leave until further review. Unpaid leave. That was it. Ania's stomach twisted as she watched reporters announce it on TV. So he gets to go home? She asked, voice hollow. Elijah didn't answer right away. His grip on his phone tightened. For now, he said. But we're not done. And he meant it. Because the next day, Elijah Benson filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the department. And this time, the whole world was watching. Because this wasn't just about Ania anymore. This was about every black child who had ever been humiliated, violated, or treated like they were nothing. And whether Officer Reynolds knew it or not. He had just started a war he couldn't win. Justice isn't automatic, it isn't guaranteed. And for people like Ania, it's often a fight just to be heard. She wasn't the first to go through this. And sadly, she won't be the last. But what made her story different was who was watching. She had a father who refused to back down, a community that stood behind her, millions of voices demanding justice. And that's the real power, not in the system, but in the people who refuse to let injustice slide. Ania's story is proof that when we stand up, speak out and fight back, change happens. So ask yourself, if you saw this happening to someone else, would you stay silent? Or would you be the voice that finally makes a difference? Because real change starts when we refuse to look away.